glad for see. I know in this episode of Gullah Talk, I am so glad you joined me today when I do presentations for educators, communities, schools, all the things. There is one question that I get all the time. What is the difference between Gullah and Geechee? And I absolutely love getting this question because it gives me a chance to really dive into some of the historical things, but a lot of the sociolinguistic, cultural, and geographical differences that I've noticed and other people have noticed as we begin to self-identify and talk about what it means to be Gullah Geechee. So we're going to take some time today to really dig into this just a little bit, and I'm excited to share with you my perspective on the difference between Gullah and Geechee. So first, let's talk about how you're going to see the name Gullah Geechee represented in the different articles, textbooks that you may read. So some scholars will write Gullah/Geechee to signify the difference between the two varieties, while others will remove the slash to try to signify uniting of the culture and it being one, despite it crossing across multiple states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. You'll see in my writing, in my earlier writing, I would write the slash, and then in more recent writings, I have decided to kind of do away with the slash a little bit. The choice for that for me was, I think it's important that people respect Gullah Geechee as one culture, one language, and one people. And of course, there's variation depending on what part of the corridor you're from. There's always going to be intercultural variation, but I like to really push that we are one. And I think taking the slash away really makes you look at it as one cohesive unit. And so no slight to anybody who still decides to use the slash, but just wanted to provide that for you so that in the event that you're reading text and you see it written differently, you might have a little bit of an understanding of why it's written those ways. So what we know about the word Gullah is that it has some origins in Angola. People were brought to the United States during the transatlantic slave trade from Angola. And in particular, one story stands out. I remember hearing it about Gullah Jack, and he was a part of the revolt with Denmark Vesey. He was brought to a plantation in Florida, but escaped to Charleston. And they didn't know a whole lot about him. So on the papers that they made to try to figure out where he was, they described him as Gullah Jack, which was a nod to the tribe in which he was from. And so we believe that Gullah originated the word from just kind of linguistic nuances from Angolan, okay? And then you have Geechee on the other side, which has some reference to the Geechee people, which are also a tribe or group from Africa who were brought over here during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, more relevant to the United States, there is the Ogeechee River in Georgia, which clearly has some connections to the word Geechee. And when we talk about the geographical differences later, you may understand a little better about why Geechee may be tied to the Ogeechee River in Georgia. So when the question is raised to me about what's the difference between Gullah and Geechee, I like to break it down into three distinct categories that I think help us see some differences in how we perceive ourselves as Gullah Geechee and maybe how other people have described us as Gullah Geechee in some of the textbooks. And those three are geographical, generational, and sociolinguistic differences. So let's talk about the first one, geographical. It's pretty obvious, but if you were to Google this question online right now, what you would see is that Gullah has been kind of reserved for Gullah Geechee people on the South Carolina Sea Islands, while Geechee has sort of been reserved for those in the Georgia Sea Islands. See there, that Ogeechee River, and Georgia. So geographical differences have been described in that way, where Gullah is reserved for South Carolina Islanders and Geechee for Georgia Islanders. But I want to take it a step further because even within those geographic regions, and specifically within South Carolina, which I know really well because I'm from here, I'm a Bunya, if you watch my previous video, we have certain ways of describing our language and sort of our identity as Gullah Geechee, also based on some geographical differences. So I recall that when we talked about people who were from the islands, Walmala, Johns Island, James Island, we would very clearly distinguish them as Gullah. And then those of us who are from a little further inland, right, in Cane Hoy, Monk's Corner, maybe even Mount Pleasant, would identify more as Geechee. And we would do that because we felt like we didn't speak as heavy as a Gullah dialect or language as those on the island. And then also kind of meeting and speaking with people who are from the islands, they tend to also refer to themselves as more Gullah than necessarily Geechee. I don't think there's a rhyme or a reason, but if you are Gullah Geechee and you're hearing this, let me know how you've self-identified, and specifically based on where you live within the corridor. I'm really, really interested in knowing that. But when it comes to these regional differences, we also see that further down in Florida, around that Jacksonville area, they tend to identify as Geechee. Those in Georgia also tend to mostly identify as Geechee. And North Carolina, I'm really not sure. So if you're Gullah Geechee from North Carolina, let me know how you identify. But here in South Carolina, as we go a little further up inland, we kind of also use both. Like we'll say, well, I'm Gullah Geechee. And you kind of just mix them together, or you just say, yeah, I'm Geechee. So it really just depends on where you live, and those geographical differences make a difference to how we self-identify as Gullah Geechee. Now, the second distinction that I like to make is a generational distinction. This has to be one of my favorite ones to talk about. I remember my grandmother, when she would speak, I loved hearing her talk. And she would use a lot of Gullah Geechee words. She would do kutta and shifarub and yeti and ana and nam and all them things. She would use a lot of the African vocabulary and vernacular that was documented in Larissa Dow Turner's book, Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect. Grab that book if you don't have it. But my grandma, I would describe as Gullah. While myself, and particularly those within my generation who had a lot more access, we were integrated, we went to mixed schools, we had a lot of exposure. And so our Gullah doesn't use as many of those African words that were found in the original basilectal variety of the language. And so this generational change that I'm talking about, to me, really has to do with the Gullah that my grandmother spoke and those within that generation and generations before her, who still carried very heavily a lot of the African vocabulary and syntax that really makes Gullah unique. And so for us, even though we don't use as much of that vocabulary, you can still hear it in the phonology, in the sound, in the rhythm, the intonation, and the pitch of our Gullah Geechee vernacular. And even like this generational thing looks like, I feel like my parents, they speak a little bit more Gullah than me, right? And I feel like I may speak a little bit more Gullah than the generation behind me. But I think it all has to do with access and opportunity. And so when you begin to have a very small select group of people who speak a specific way become integrated into mainstream, we feel like we have to change to fit in to mainstream. And because of that, certain Creole-like nature of the language is lost. That process is called decreolization, meaning we're losing some of those features that make the language uniquely Creole. And it's natural. Languages change because we come in contact with different people at different times. We have different opportunities. We travel, we do all of the things. So it's not a bad thing, but I think it's important to note the differences between Gullah and Geechee are not just geographical, but in many ways generational. And I think that's why work that people are doing to help preserve the language by recording and doing interviews, and hopefully one day getting into having some Gullah language lessons available for people to learn that original variety of the language, are going to be really important for us preserving the authenticity of it for generations to come. And so there are generational differences that I think are beautiful. And so I love hearing our elders speak, because you really get to hear that deep, authentic Gullah Geechee. And last but not least, I want to talk about the sociolinguistic differences. So what do I mean? It's those social language constructs and social language environments that really kind of shift the narrative about what is the difference between Gullah and Geechee. And so what we see again, that's that generational divide. But my social sphere said, or I was taught, don't speak Gullah Geechee outside of the home. Don't use the language, or you're not going to have that upward social mobility. That's what we were told. But that's because, our people wanted us to achieve more than they did. If they went to high school, they want us to go to college. If you went to college, they want you to want to go to grad school, right? It's almost like one up from the next. And so because of some of those sociolinguistic nuances, it's caused some people to not use the language as much, or to use a variety that is not as using a lot of the African words that we know to be traditionally Gullah Geechee, or Gullah, if you will. And so people would describe it more as Geechee. And so what you're going to find is some younger people might be like, well, I'm not Gullah. I don't talk like that. But yeah, I Geechee, right? And so don't be surprised if you hear that kind of nuance. And I know when I was growing up, that's sort of how we identify. I was like, well, yeah, I Geechee, but I ain't really Gullah. Because I don't speak the African words like maybe somebody in the older generation. And so there are all these sociolinguistic things happening. You have a language that is very, very unique, has its own grammar, has its own structure, but is also very heavily influenced by the society around it. And if society is speaking mainstream, then the speakers of Gullah are trying to assimilate to that mainstream, which causes it to sound really different than the traditional Gullah. And so people then begin to refer to it as Geechee. There is one person who brought up at some point that Geechee is the dialect of Gullah. As a linguist, I've been trying in my mind to kind of reconcile that theory for a while, and I haven't really been able to substantiate it. But what I think is that it is what we see because of the geographical, because of the generational difference, and because of the sociolinguistic differences. We see a less creolized version of the original Gullah language. And so people have sort of labeled that as Geechee to kind of separate and talk about the differences that they're hearing within the language. But to reiterate, for me, Gullah Geechee is one people, one language, one. And I think it's beautiful that we could have conversations like this about Gullah Geechee, understanding that we are a beautiful blend of people from the motherland who were brought here against our will, but we were able to create an amazing language that people at this point love to listen to and really want to understand. So I said all of that to say, what is the difference between Gullah and Geechee? We all the same child, but there are some differences depending on where you live, depending on the generation that you come from, and depending on some of those sociolinguistic constructs. So let me know in the chat what you've heard are the differences between Gullah and Geechee. And if you're from any of these regions, let me know how you self-identify, because that's really big. How do we identify. Personally, I'm Gullah Geechee all day long. I talk about being both of them. I use the language more in some instances, and sometimes I choose not to. But like I always tell my students, it's my choice, it's yours, how I use my Gullah Geechee. So I hope you learned something. I hope that you may be able to go and spread the news about what the difference is between Gullah and Geechee after watching this video. I'm glad for Sienna, and I sure hope I can see Sienna again. If you enjoyed this video, please smash the like button, but also do not forget to subscribe so that you will not miss any future episodes of Gullah Talk. I can't wait to see you guys again in the next one. Are.